Okay, so first, this one I'm just adding in for fun. There's some stuff on our site about expressions, and I know I haven't talked about them a lot, but I want to introduce some things related to wiggle, looping time, time expression. I don't know how much I'll get through because if you can hear in between while I'm talking, there is construction going on outside. So this one is going to be weird, so bear with me. But I'll try to do this as painlessly as possible. And some of the stuff that's in the project file that I'm working with is in a later video, so I'm kind of going back right now. But in terms of timing wise, this should be pretty straightforward. So the first thing I wanted to address is the wiggle expression. And the wiggle expression is a way to add randomness into something. So when we have a motion graphic, like the sort of thing that we're working on, hang on, let me turn that down a little bit, because it'll get annoying. So one of the things that you may run into as you're working on this is that once we get things onto the frame, he's talking for a long time, and in order to illustrate the concept, we need the assets to stay there, right? So when he's talking about Wisconsin and 8 of this and 2 of the other equals 10 electoral college votes, that doesn't take very long to animate. But it needs to be on the screen for however long that little segment is in order for the viewer to really get an understanding of what's going on. And so what you'll end up with, or what you might start to notice while you're working on the project later, is that things might start to get kind of static. So in this section, right, here in particular, some of the stuff is really not doing very much, right? There's transitions, it's animating on or off the screen, but I'm going to want to definitely do something a little bit more to make it more dynamic, I guess is the easiest way to think about it. So when we have something like this in the frame, a way to make it a little bit more dynamic would be for us to add additional keyframes in so that it was moving on the screen. It wasn't just static there all of the time. Basically, we could sort of make a rule in our head that even though we want something to be on the screen for 10, 15, 20 seconds or whatever, it should also be moving. Or it shouldn't come to a complete rest all of the time. And one strategy for that would be to use your keyframes as you block them in, and then maybe move some of those positions over a little bit or up. And since I'm working on position and going back inside, I'm going to do my keyframe interpolation. Oh, where is it? Yes. And turn this on to linear because I don't want it to drift around too much. But just by moving it a little bit, it's kind of a subtle action, but it isn't at a complete rest all of the time through the sequence. So you see here, it's sort of drifting in the frame a little bit. And that's something that we can do really easily, and you can add it in at any time. Another option, I'm going to undo that, work. There we go. Okay. And another option would be to add randomness, so that position or scale or rotation or whatever has some keyframes in it that I don't have to add manually, but will make it more dynamic. So I'm going to go into the position and I'm going to add an expression called wiggle. Wiggle expression is probably the easiest one to understand. It's basically a script that will randomly generate values in between your keyframes, whatever those are. And wiggle has 2 values. It has a frequency and a magnitude. So the frequency would be how often it happens, and that is measured by how many times per second, not per frame. And then a magnitude. And the magnitude would depend on what property you're animating. So in this case, if it's position, then that would be a pixel dimension. If it was a rotation, it would be degrees. So that part of the expression can be a little bit complicated, but it's fairly easy to understand and kind of fun to play around with. So the expression is wiggle. There is auto completer for expressions now, which helps a lot. But I just need to add in two values with a comma in between them, and I'm done. So let's say I want this to happen 5 times a second, which is going to be way too much, and I want it to be 200 pixels 5 times a second. What's going to end up happening is that that guy, that object, whatever it is going to start to jiggle all over the frame. So the to me, that's I always start by adding in crazy values just to see that it's working, but then I'll come back and refine it. And more likely, what I want is for this to be somewhat subtle. So maybe it's just going to be 1 time a second, and it's only going to be 10 pixels. So now, just like before when I was adding in that drift, that object is moving on the frame, but it's not screwing up my composition. It's still dynamic. I still have my keyframes in there, but it isn't completely static, which will help to kind of keep things going over a longer section. Now, you probably have a question, this project is going to be crazy, right? It's 2.5 minutes long of voiceover, and the script is long. Just keep in mind that we're not doing the same thing as we did with Kinetic Type, where we were animating everything. In this case, we're illustrating what he's saying. And so that's where having these compositions and having some moments where there's a lot of rest, but things are still moving on the frame will be really, really useful. So the other way that we can add wiggle to something, and there are other expressions. There's a Gauss random one, which adds, just like wiggle, it adds randomness to it, something. So there are a bunch of other expressions, but wiggle is the easiest one. There's also a tool called the Wiggler. And I don't want to go through that too much because I don't think it's super practical all the time. But the Wiggler you can open by just going under the window menu. And what the Wiggler does is it adds keyframes. So where the expression, you just sort of like type it in and you can replace values and stuff like that. What the Wiggler does is it adds in keyframes for you, which sometimes is good because then you can sort of move them around or whatever. But in terms of like updating it, you'd have to just like undo or delete all of those keyframes. So sometimes it's not super practical. But anyway, the way that it works is relatively the same. Select your property. And in this case, I'm just going to go in between those main keyframes. It's going to be applied to the spatial path instead of time. So it's going to be where it's moving visually. The noise type, so it's adding in random noise, is smooth, so it won't be like crazy jittery. But there are other options for that as well. And in this case, it's going to do all independently. So for position, that would be the X and the Y. So they'll be just doing them separate. And there's the frequency, how many times per second, and the magnitude, just like the expression itself. So maybe I could turn this on to 1 and 10 or 20 again. And then what I would do is press apply. And you'll see that in my timeline now, it's added all of the keyframes in between there. And I can see that same sort of action happening. So the two different ways to get the same thing, to add in some random noise into something so that we could animate it. Now, I really quickly want to just do something else. And I don't know that this is super practical, but I just wanted to make you aware of how to do it. And if you wanted to investigate a little bit more, or if you had a question, just let me know. Let's duplicate this. I'm just going to get rid of everything other than the Wisconsin. And I'm going to also just get rid of all of the keyframes. So let's go back to where it was in the center, which is here. And I'm just going to get rid of all that stuff. Now, I wanted to briefly mention another expression, and that's the time expression. And time can be used for making something happen in a very regular or systematic way. The most of the time where you would see it used is like something like a clock, or where we want something to be like repeating in a really, really regular way. I'm actually even going to get rid of the audio out of this one, and I'm going to change this composition size. to just a couple of seconds, because I also want to show you how to do looping. Let's say we've got this guy in here and we want him to rotate like a clock or something like that. Under rotation, again, I would just go up under Add Expression. And there are shortcut keys for it, but I never remember it. And what I can say is time, and then let me look at my notes. Oh yeah. So the time property now will take whatever your object is and divide all of the frames out in order to do motion. So you'll notice it's rotating. If I wanted it to rotate more, I would just add some math to it. So time times 2, so it would be twice as fast. So now it's going to rotate twice as far in the same amount of time. Essentially what it's doing is dividing up however many frames you have and then animating that object over that time. Now, just for fun, let's see what happens if we add in a couple of keyframes. So let's say we're going from 0 to, at the end, we want this to be 45. It's not going to work, right? Essentially, this expression would be taking the place of adding keyframes, and then we just use math to divide it out. So let's say 360. So now it's going to go almost full 360 degrees over the course of the time. So if I were doing a clock or whatever, this would be a really fast way to prototype that. This isn't really going to be very practical, but I just wanted to walk through it. So let's say that I wanted to bring this kind of thing in. I've got something animated, and I just want this to be constantly looping, and it only takes 2 seconds to make the full circle or the full rotation, but I wanted it to happen for 10 seconds. This is where things can get a little bit complicated. And that is that let's imagine that this little rotation is going to be part of a 20-second section of my project. So I've got 2 seconds, and it's just going to disappear, right? In order to build this up, I can duplicate compositions and I can offset times. So this would be a shortcut way, or I guess not shortcut, but the long way of doing something that would loop. So I break it down into its smallest section, I animate it, and then I just repeat that composition over and over again, and I can have it on the screen for however long I might need it to be. So that's the long way, duplicating, making a lot of layers, but I could nest that pre-composition into another one, so I could sequence it a number of different ways. There's another way to do this with an expression as well, and that would be to add looping. So I will grab the layer, whatever it is. I'll go up under the layer time menu, and then I'll say enable time remapping. A quick summary, time remap is a property that can be added to something that has a duration. So mostly it works for pre-compositions or video files or something like that. And what it does is it adds a keyframe for the first frame and the last frame of something. And those are basically times. So they're like a timestamp for something. Now, if I wanted to, after I add that time remapping property to something, I can stretch it out. And what will happen then is that it will sort of stay on the screen for whatever the duration is. If I move that second keyframe, let's say to the end, what I would be doing is stretching that time. So whatever those 2 seconds were now are stretched to 20 seconds, and it's going to move more slowly. So this is one way that we can retime something really easily by just moving its keyframes around for a time remap property. But what I really wanted to do was to just make this keep repeating over and over again. And this is where the expression would come in. I'll highlight my time remap property. I'll go back and add my expression again. And this one is the one that's a little bit different. It should be called loop out with a capital O and then cycle. So it's different. It's not super complicated, but what it's going to be telling the software to do is to repeat those 2 keyframes over and over again for whatever duration that layer is trimmed to. So fast. It's got a little drop frame in there, and you'll see that happen occasionally. And if you, sometimes it happens and sometimes it doesn't. The workaround for it is to just go into that last keyframe, whatever it was. So I'll jump to that keyframe, and then I, with my player controls, go one frame back, add a keyframe, and then delete the last one. So sometimes, just depending on like the duration of something, there's an extra drop frame in there or whatever, and the way to solve it is just to add a keyframe before and then get rid of the last one. That was all I wanted to talk about for fun. And to add in, I know that really the project is just getting started, but if it's at all useful, there are some really fun ways that we can think about taking, I guess, an approach to the explainer where we're not trying to fill all of the time with all kinds of animation, but we're still illustrating the concepts in a clear way visually, and then adding in some more subtle animations so that things are more dynamic on the screen without detracting from the user's or viewer's ability to read and see, and then pair the information from the voiceover with what they see on the screen, because that's the end goal for the project. All right, thanks. Talk soon.